Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Brewers Minute. So I got a question this week asking, how do I know how many of specific cards I should play in my deck? The person said, I pretty much understand 4-ofs, I kind of understand 1-ofs, but why would I ever play a card as a 2-of or as a 3-of? And I think that's a really important and interesting question that definitely impacts brewing and deck building. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. How many is the name of this week's Brewers Minute. So a quick reminder before we break down how many. If you enjoy Brewers Minute and the other series here on the channel, it would be amazing of you if you could take a quick second, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So I think the way to do this is go number by number and talk about why cards are commonly played at that number. So let's start off with the easiest one, and that is 4-ofs. And what playing a card as a 4-of says is, I want this card every single game, and I'm okay with drawing multiples of that card. So if you look at the math, as a 4-of, you're going to have that card in your opening hand about 40% of the time. And as the game goes along, to turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, odds are in favor of you having a copy of that card, and the odds are not bad by the middle to late game that you actually draw a second copy, maybe 25% of the time, 1 in every 4 games. So these are the cards that are the foundation of decks, and most cards that are key to a deck are played as 4-ofs. So instead of talking about all the cards that are played as 4-ofs, because they're just simply the most important cards to your deck, the easier thing to do is talk about a couple of exceptions and cards that you don't want to play as 4-ofs. And that would be, number 1, expensive cards. If the card is 5 mana, 6 mana, 7 mana, because of curve concerns, you're likely not going to play that card as a 4-of, even if it's really good and really important to your deck. You're more likely to play 3 or 2 or even 1. Another thing is legends. Maybe Ronas is the best card in your entire deck, but the fact that it's not only a legend, but an indestructible legend means that if you draw additional copies, they're likely to be dead cards, so it's risky to play that card as a 4-of. Even though it's cheap, even though it's efficient, if it wasn't legendary, it would easily be a 4-of in every deck that could play it. But because it's a legend, you tend to play a couple less copies, a single less copy for that purpose. And along the same lines, we have Planeswalkers, which suffer from the same legendary problem. It's really dependent on how the individual Planeswalker works. Let's say Liliana of the Veil in Modern is often a 4-of because you're going to negative it, make your opponent sack something, plus it, you can negative it again, Liliana's gone, you play another copy. But if it's Nicole Bolas, the God Pharaoh, you're more likely to play it as a 1-of because it's going to have a ton of loyalty, it's likely not going to die, it's probably just going to win you the game. So that's the 4-of slot. Cards that you want every single game and you want to draw in multiples. The 3-of slot is kind of like the 4-of slot. It says, I want to draw this card every single game, but I don't really want to draw a second copy of it. And that's the main change in the math. Yes, you lose a bit of percentage points when it comes to having a copy in your opening hand. It drops from about 40% to just over 30%. However, when you look at the math for turn 6, turn 7, as a 3-of, you're still likely going to find that card. Odds are in favor of you finding a copy, but odds are much lower that you're actually going to find a second copy. So this is often 4-ofs with a drawback. For example, Ronas. Maybe Ronas is great, but you don't want to play as a 4-of because of the legendary problem. So you play it as a 3-of, which means you're still likely going to find it by the middle of the game, but you're significantly less likely to have a second copy of Ronas cluttering up your hand. We also see this with cards that are too expensive. So Bristling Hydra, Verdurous Gearhulk, and some of the Teamer energy decks in Standard are super powerful, but the decks are playing like 22 lands, which is pretty low. They might not always get to 4 and 5 mana on time, so they're more often playing those cards as 3-ofs rather than 4-ofs, even though they're great, just because of curve considerations. And again, almost like a legendary card, if you open your hand and it's 3 5-drops and some lands, it's probably a mulligan because it's just too slow, so you're trying to control for that and still find a copy of that card, but not necessarily have it in your opening 7. The other thing that's really important is 3-ofs are often cards that win you the game when you cast them, so they're not necessary in multiples. So a great example of this in a current standard deck is Dust to Dawn in the blue-white Monument deck. When you cast a Dust to Dawn, and then you aftermath it to get all your creatures back from the graveyard, you don't really need a second copy because you're destroying your opponent's board most likely, then you're drawing like 5 or 10 cards and just winning the game. So drawing extra copies isn't really necessary. Yeah, you want the first one, but if the first one's going to just win you the game, why do you need the second one? So that's the 3 of slot. You are basically saying, I really want a copy of this card, but I don't want more than one. Moving on to the 2 of slot, and the 2 of slot is the most confusing slot. It's really hard to understand why a deck would play a card as a 2 of, and from what I've found, there are maybe 3 reasons to play a card as a 2 of. The most legitimate ones are curve concerns. So an example of this is Green-Black Delirium in Standard. The deck plays a whopping 14 2-drops. You got Walking Ballista, you got Gifted Aetherborn, you got Winding Constrictor. That brings you up to 12. That means you got 2 more 2-drop slots left, and the deck uses those slots on Sylvan Advocate. So Sylvan Advocate might be the 4th best 2-drop for the deck, but since you still have additional 2-drop slots, you can easily just slide it into that spot. So if curve considerations dictate that you play a card as a 2 of, that's a pretty legitimate reason. Along the same lines, the blue-white Monument deck often has 2 stasis snares, and that's the deck basically like, I have 2 spots for removal, so I guess I'm going to play it as a 2 of. I don't want to cut any of my other cards that are more important to my plan, but I do want some amount of removal, so that's all I can do. Another legitimate reason to play a card as a 2 of is when it's additional copies of a card that you really want. So there's some interesting math when it comes to drawing cards. We already talked about, as a 4 of, you're about 40% to have a card in your opening hand, but if you can jump that number up to 6 of, you're actually 54%. So the odds are in favor of drawing a card in your opening hand if you have 6 copies in your deck. And of course, you can't play 6 actual copies of a card in your deck, but a deck like Titan Scapeshift, Titan Breach Scapeshift in Modern, they really want Primeval Titan. So they play 4 Primeval Titans, and then they usually have 2 Summoners packs, which are essentially just 5 and 6 of Primeval Titan, additional copies, which bumps the math up, so it's in favor of you having a copy in your opening 7, which is what the deck really wants, because Titan is that important. So sometimes you play a 2 of as additional copies of an effect that you already have. Finally, there's one semi-less legit reason, and that is, you're kind of like lukewarm on a card. An example of this would be Eldrazi Obligator. Has been seeing plays at 2 of in the mono-red Eldrazi deck in Standard. And I don't know if I can completely justify this deck building decision. It feels like it's someone saying, I don't really want this card in most matchups, but I do want it in some matchups. So I'm going to put it in my main deck and hope I get lucky and draw it in the good matchups, and hope I get lucky and don't draw it in the bad matchups. I almost think if you're thinking that way, it's better to just not play the card at all. But when you consider that some pros talk about building a 75 rather than a 60, and thinking of your sideboard and main deck is one deck, it makes a little bit more sense in that context. Maybe Eldrazi Obligator is a sideboard card that the deck's pilot found was better off to have in the main deck, so the sideboard could be used on other slots. So if you think of it as a 75 card deck rather than a 60 card deck, you can sometimes see more justifications for the 2 ofs. Finally, we have the 1 ofs, and 1 ofs are pretty simple. They say 2 things. They either say, I don't really care about drawing this card, or more often, I have a way of finding this card when I do want this card. So occasionally you see Kalitas, Trader of Gat, just be a 1 of, and that's someone saying, like, Kalitas is good. Maybe I'll find it sometimes, maybe I won't. If I do, that's fine. If I don't, that's fine. But more often, you see 1-ofs being tutor targets. Maybe you're playing a Court of Calling deck, so you can play a 1-of, still find it when you want it. Or you see expensive finishers fall into this slot, Nicole Bolas, God Pharaoh, in the standard control decks. Often a 1-of, you're planning on going long, you're planning on drawing a ton of cards, so sooner or later, you're going to draw into that Nicole Bolas. You don't really want it in your opening hand because it's a ton of mana, but sooner or later, you're going to find it. And then the other reason you sometimes see 1-ofs is split. So Mardu Vehicles, for example, I've seen some deck lists that have 4 slots for early game removal spells, and instead of just playing 4 Fatal Pushes, they play 3 Fatal Pushes and 1 copy of a Braid. So it's a way you can just kind of squeeze another other effect in. Most of the time, a Braid's just going to be Fatal Push, but it gives you that little additional upside of getting rid of an artifact. So sometimes you see one-ofs thanks to weird splits as well, but the most common reason is a card's really expensive and you're planning on the game going long and you'll find it, or you have ways to tutor out that card, or you just don't care, like we talk about with Cletus. Yeah, I'm not going to draw this most games, but every once in a while I'll find it and it'll hopefully be good. So that's the breakdown on how many when it comes to deck building. So just to recap, 4 ofs, you want this card every single game and you are fine with drawing multiples of it. 3 ofs is I want this card every single game, but I don't really ever want to draw 2 of them, or usually draw 2 of them. And then 2 ofs is the weird slot where you have curve concerns, you have additional copies, or the more meta deck building question of just how many of this effect can I fit, and the number ends up being 2. And then 1 ofs is either I don't really care if I draw this, but I want to play it, or I have ways of finding this when I need it, so I can get by playing it as a 1 of. Anyway, that's been our Brewers Minute for this week. How many do you need for your decks? Hopefully this has been helpful and gives you some sort of guideline, I guess, when it comes to building your own decks. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.